Please join me in welcoming Dilip Cunha.
Thank you, Farina. Thank you all very much for being here. It's truly a pleasure to be back in Michigan. I mean, I think this is about the third or fourth time that I'm here, but this is the first time that I feel, that I've been invited to a social science gathering, as it were. And even though I know designers are involved, it's always a pleasure to speak to social scientists and scientists about some of the issues that we as designers think about. Or let us say, what we like to think about, and we don't very often get a chance. We do work on varied landscapes, and perhaps that is because we have this ability to fly above them, as it were, and not get as engaged as many of you undoubtedly do. But we've been in all kinds of places, and in fact, yesterday, I mean, just because we're based at Penn, and I teach the introductory class in landscape architecture, the studio in landscape architecture. We took the students out to Bartram's garden. I don't know if you're familiar with John Bartram, who was this amazing character who eventually ended up becoming the botanist of King George III. But he started the garden in a garden in Philadelphia. And it's a wonderful seed. And it's fascinating for us how people look at gardens as enclosures, and that to some extent is an etymological definition of garden. And so very often when we say that, when we speak of landscape architecture, people think that we are, that we're talking about designing, the surface, as it were, or designing gardens. But the fantastic thing about the botanical garden and about Bartram's garden, I mean, over there is located the first ginkgo tree, in the United States, or let's say the oldest ginkgo tree right now, but I believe it was also the first, or one of the first ginkgo trees. But botanical gardens have this amazing ability of transforming actually the landscape like no other thing has in the world. I mean, the botanical gardens that the British started all over the Indian peninsula, but the British Empire, I mean, had this wonderful exchange of plants that carried things, so much so that today we really don't know what's indigenous and what's exotic. But plants, I mean, one of the things that we wanted to open students to was the fact that plants can be transplanted, and it's a very easy thing actually for a student to grasp. What I want to talk about today actually is the transplanting of something that seems a little more difficult to defend, and that is the river. The idea that rivers are constructed things that have been carried, to a large extent in the eye, and in the cultivation of the eye is something that I'm going to try to put forth over here. And as I hope it'll make sense by the end of it. But to me, basically, rivers are lines in space. I mean, when you see a river flood, it basically is water crossing a line. And so who drew that line? I mean, it is an act of drawing, and that entity has become an ontological entity that has become the subject of science and has become the basis of design. And I can't go into actually the edifice that has been constructed on the ground of the river. But the river, as a drawn line, before it is a flow of water on the earth, belongs in a geographic surface. And today what I want to critique actually is South Asia as a geographic surface. And I want to suggest that South Asia is a hydrological surface, meaning that it is a rain terrain, that water is everywhere before it is somewhere, and water is not somewhere before it is everywhere, which is what a geographic surface presumes. Water is there, and land is here. I don't know how many of you have tried dividing water from land. It can only be the work of God. It's something that, and I should say, a surveyor. They have this fantastic ability of drawing a line where nobody else sees one, and where nobody else can draw one. But yet today we all accept the line. We all accept a blue and a brown. We all look at land like as if it is not raining. It's not raining here, it's not raining there. We look at it like as if we are in Egypt. So there is some sense actually that there is an idea here that has been carried and transplanted. So therefore, what I ask is South Asia a geographic surface where water is somewhere rather than everywhere, a land drained by rivers, a land where rivers have not surprisingly become drains? Or is it a hydrological surface where water is everywhere before it is somewhere? Now, for 2,500 years, we have privileged a geographic surface. In the writing of history, in our understanding of culture and ecology, and in planning and design. Today, we need to ask if that was the right choice, and if, by doing so, we took a more simplistic route that has led us to the environmental mess that we are in today. To see water everywhere is to ask how we have come to see and believe that it is somewhere, as shown in geographic maps, and why. In other words, why do we see South Asia at a chosen moment in the hydrological cycle when water seems to have a clear and distinct place on the Earth's surface, and not when it is precipitating, seeping into aquifers, soaking air, soil, vegetation, collecting in wells, terraces, and cisterns, evaporating, transpiring, and sublimating? Why do we choose to see South Asia as a geographic rather than hydrological surface? What you see over here, is what you would normally call a hydrological cycle, but it is, to a large extent, a simplification. In that, one tends to actually look at water, the sea, as a kind of starting point. Water is evaporating and then precipitating on land and then running off into the sea. It, of course, is much more complex when you think that water is evaporating everywhere and condensing everywhere, seeping into the soil, soaking in, perhaps reaching the sea through aquifers, or remaining in aquifers for centuries, if not millennia. But the point that I'm making is that rivers are a moment here. And that chosen moment has been extracted for the purpose of maps, but not just for the purpose of maps. It's also for the purpose of policy. It's for the purposes of design. It's a sight to any designer is water there, land here. No surveyor goes out in the middle of the rain to survey. And I want to actually build on this idea that once you actually have rivers, you are working with linear flows. And when you're working with linear flows, you're working with a sense of origin and a sense of destination. And that linearity, feeds into all kinds of ideas analogously. We think of history, we think of civilization, everything in this linear manner. So rivers actually become the starting point of a philosophy. And what I want to actually expose over here is actually the thought process of people that we would associate here with the school of Miletus, Thales and Anaximander, who are, some would consider the originators of science, of empirical science, in 6th century BC. They were the ones who actually began much of their investigation by looking at water, and they contained water between lines. And that act of containing water between lines then led to actually looking at other people who did not see water between lines as, not having it all. So I want to actually build on that, beginning from there, as it were. So one of the consequences of seeing water in a geographic fair weather moment is the sighting, the seeing and sighting of rivers as drains of land. And that's what we all learned in schools, right? That rivers drain land. And today they are drains, so we shouldn't be surprised. As channels that grant water their own space, channels defined by banks drawn with lines. So you can't think flow without seeing lines. That's the idea here. Lines that have held sway. Basically, it's an image that has held sway since the invention of the world map by academics on the Mediterranean rim in the 6th century BC, becoming the taken for granted time of reality. So it's a time of reality that has become reality, a time in which not only are maps drawn, but properties are demarcated, decisions are made, the past is described, and the future is considered. Now, just to throw things a little bit into complexity, if I had to go to Benares or Varanasi today, actually, and pull a glass of water out of the Ganges, and if I had to ask a pilgrim over there where this water comes from, they will undoubtedly tell me that it comes from Gangotri, which is supposedly the source of the Ganga. or I would like to say Ganges, because Ganges is the river, Ganga is the goddess. But so let's just remain with the word Ganges. But if you just think about it, what about the rain that actually falls right there, or the rain that falls a little further up? Where does that water go? I mean, isn't that part of the source? What about the water that comes out of the aquifers? Actually, after spending a lot of time over there, when the aquifers gets filled, it overflows into the Ganges. What about the water that actually trickles down trees that land up in the Ganges? What about the water that comes through the toilets, of all the land up there, actually, that passes through human beings, actually, and ends up in the Ganges? All this water actually has different sources. So why do we go to that one source, Gangotri? I mean, there's fascinating, actually, amount of history that suggests that rivers did not begin for many, many centuries in the minds of scholars in a point source. It began where it exited the mountains, actually. And so Hardwar was actually considered the place of Gaumukh, which is the cow's head, which was another way of referring to the source of the Ganga. But not Gangotri. Somewhere between the 15th century and the 18th century, Gaumukh moved back to Gangotri. And actually, there was a priest, actually, a Jesuit by the name of Tiefenthaler, who drew the first map of the Ganges going back and beginning in Gangotri. Before that, they began in Haridwar, or actually, just went into the mountains. But a pilgrim actually went to Haridwar and then dispersed to multiple points. They did not go to Gangotri as the source, and they were not looking for a source. They considered the whole mountain range was the abode of Shiva. And so that was considered to be the source. So when did it become a point source? The idea of a line originating somewhere demands a point source, and I want to get into that. But just for a moment, remaining with the complexity of the waters actually in Varanasi, you would ask the question then, what about the waters then that comes down as rain, even if it comes here? Where did that come from? It comes from the Indian Ocean. Where does the water from the Indian Ocean come from? It could cycle from another part of the world. So the water that is actually coming past Varanasi has had many lives before and has come across the earth. Leonardo da Vinci made this observation of the Nile. He says all the watery element has come through the Nile, not one time, but many times. So that sense actually then of the complexity of the Ganga as a river is itself actually, extendable in many different directions. But I want to actually challenge that very notion of Ganga as a river and ask the question, is Ganga a rain terrain? Now, it is not easy to challenge the geographic surface and the empire that has been built on it. It is even more difficult to see a habitation suited to the belief that water is everywhere before it is somewhere, suited, that is, to the hydrological surface. Our whole education is grounded in a geographic surface. It's amazing. So I'm going to ask you to stretch your imagination over here and see if I can help with that. But seeing South Asia in the monsoon is a good place to begin. The southwest monsoon is a wind which moves, as Leonardo da Vinci said, all air moves like a river and carries the clouds with it, just as running water carries all the things that float upon it. Now, the clouds that this wind carries from June to September can become exceptionally heavy and deep with moisture skimmed off the Indian Ocean. So you see the arrows coming in from the southwest over here. As it moves to the northeast. Now, these clouds strike the sides of hills and mountain ranges from Ethiopia. You see Ethiopia over here, the highlands of Ethiopia. To the far east, or rather, as Al-Biruni, the 11th century scholar from Central Asia put it, the mountainsides strike against the clouds, and the clouds are pressed like olives or grapes, in consequence of which the rain pours down. Now, this wind then becomes rain across a vast frontier. At its western extreme, this rain overflows the Ethiopian highlands. So I've straightened out those elements that you see over here. I've straightened it out in a frontier from there, from the Ethiopian highlands to the hills of Chittagong over here. And this is the southwest monsoon coming in. And you get over here the Western Ghats of India. and the pocket of India actually in the rain shadow area before it hits the Himalayas. And then you get a rain shadow area over here where, between the Caucasus Mountains and actually this range. Now this over here is actually a fantastic route. This is where the Silk Road was, in the rain shadow. The Silk Road all the way there. Alexander came down this route. And he crossed at some point, actually, he crossed the Khyber Pass and comes into the Indian peninsula, as it were. But this is just to orient you to the monsoon. So this wind then becomes rain across a vast frontier. At its western extreme, this rain overflows the Ethiopian mountains toward the leeward side. Toward the leeward side, that's the other side of the mountain. So the Nile actually begins in the Ethiopian highlands and flows behind into the rain shadow area, as it were, and inundates basically the narrow, rainless plain of Egypt. Further east, it overflows the Himalayas, but towards the windward side. So the Indus and the Ganges flow towards the windward side. So the land is already saturated with rain before it basically comes down from the mountains, inundating plains that are already rain saturated. Now these arms of the monsoon, wind in Egypt and South Asia, as different as they are, do not begin in point sources at the start of flows edged by banks. They rather begin in a multiplicity of surfaces which hold rain where it falls until it exceeds their holding capacity, at which time it overflows their surfaces, extending some of them all the way to the sea, while others are more successful in holding rain back by absorbing or containing it. With rain reaching into the interstices of soils and cells and pores of organisms, or remaining suspended in pockets of air before it overflows, it is impossible to separate land from water. Indeed, the impulse to make such a separation does not occur. Surfaces here are emergent and transfiguring, a consequence of the multiplicity, possibility, and complexity of materials, routes, and times. So it's overflows versus flows, surface flows versus saturation and then overflows. The rainless plains of Egypt, a green gash of teeming life cutting across brown desert waste, gathers many such surfaces, most of which, particularly in times of inundation, reach back to the high grounds of Ethiopia, although some will surely extend into the Lake Victoria region of Africa, and some will surely extend to those surfaces wetted by clouds that veered off course in the midst of all the complexities of pressures and releases of air. The rain-saturated plains of South Asia, on the other hand, gather surfaces, some of which reach back to beginnings in high grounds, such as the Western Ghats or the Himalayas, perhaps a glacier, a snowfield, an aquifer, a terrace, recesses or dips that have held rain for extents of time varying from eons to minutes. Most surfaces, however, likely reach only a fraction of that distance to where rain fell just a moment ago, in a vicinity of the plains itself. Now, people in Egypt and South Asia worked and continue to work these surfaces, extending and containing them, directing and holding their overflows. These arms of the monsoon wind, then, are not channels of water. They are thick surfaces of wetness, ranging from shallow, muddy silt to deep, muddy waters. Like a stain on a blotting paper, these surfaces extend by overflows and contain by absorption and holding that can sometimes run deep. Locals in Egypt and in South Asia called this thick surface ocean. The Sanskrit word is Sindhu, which, despite meaning ocean, is translated as river in general and Indus in particular. A Greek scholar, and I refer to Diodorus Siculus, visiting Egypt in the 1st century BC, found there referring to their country as ocean. He figured that it was because it was from whence, quote, from whence they derive the origins of their gods, or possibly because primitive Egyptians named the moist element ocean. Now to him, though, this was not knowledge. It was lack of knowledge, in keeping, as he said, in keeping with their own ignorance. Like other Greek scholars of his day, he took a geographic view of the Earth's surface, rather than a hydrological one. Rather than a surface of wetness, he saw a surface divided between the space of land and the space of water, terra firma and H2O, a divide necessary to the geographic map. In Egypt, as Greek scholars reaching back to the 6th century BC had done, he confined water to a channel with lines and then watched with scientific curiosity as waters deemed abnormal violated this channel and erased his lines each year in flood. This normal channel with abnormal waters was to them the river Nile. It is not surprising that Herodotus, who shared this map view of Egypt, could find no one who could explain this abnormal behavior or locate the point or points where it began. His frustration with the locals, whom he says knew nothing, would become a common refrain of visiting scholars and academics, not just in Egypt, but on the Indian subcontinent as well, where European men of science, as recently as 19th century, were amazed to find locals without any knowledge of the points where the lines of rivers began. Of course, the locals who saw a thick hydrological surface rather than a geographical one did not inhabit a world of rivers. They knew better than to divide a hydrological surface between land and water. Put another way, they knew better than to incarcerate the monsoon wind. They rather appreciated the complexity of the surface, extending and directing its wetness. All along the frontier of the monsoon, people deemed ignorant rather than gifted with a unique hydrological imagination, were deemed ignorant rather than gifted with a unique hydrological imagination, one that made them not just see things differently, but allowed them to see different things. And I want to emphasize that, not seeing differently, but seeing different things. Thus the academics, accompanying Alexander, when they crossed the Hindu Kush, wondered, as they did in Egypt, at why water defied lines. Aristobulus, an architect and engineer who traveled with Alexander, speaks of an Indus that, quote, had abandoned its proper bed and had turned aside into the other bed on the left that was much deeper and flowed with precipitous descent, like a cataract, so that the Indus no longer watered by its overflows the abandoned country on the right, since the country was now above the level, not only of the new stream, but also of its overflows. But as in Egypt, they were driven to place water in channels, to civilize terrain. It was a lot more difficult task here on the windward side of the mountains than it was in the leeward side as in Egypt. To the channel of the Indus, they would add the 5 rivers of the Punjab. And with information from Megasthenes, the Ganges. And you can see over here that this is Eratosthenes' map, actually, where the Ganges has been added actually to the Indus as for the first time, sort of figures in maps. And Alexander was the first person to use the word Ganges, at least on record. And then of course you find, rivers, have their own place. And then you have the National Geographic, recent National Geographic map that actually shows only the rivers of the world, and no land. So somehow water now is standing on its own. Isn't that remarkable? The Ganges and eventually other rivers that would define the subcontinent as a geographic surface where the space of land is separated from the space of water. It would take many centuries to locate the points where the lines of rivers began. It often required holding channels long enough to survey them. The movements of these channels continued to amaze British surveyors in the 18th century as they did Alexander's men. Surveyor Robert Colebrook, a keen student of these movements, noted, "The frequent alteration in the course of the Ganges and of other rivers have been a subject of wonder to the generality of Europeans residing in these provinces. Although the natives who have long witnessed such changes, the most remarkable encroachments of the river and deviations of their streams are productive of little surprise." Now, after Colebrook, the Brahmaputra changed course significantly from the east of Dhaka to the west, while the Kosi has long defied efforts of being tied down. In 2010, the Indus turned very much turned Pakistan into a lake as Alexander's actually men saw it, and so on. I mean, I can give you any number of examples of the so-called floods. But as in Egypt, scholars have long found their wonder neither shared nor understood by locals. Before I move away from this map, I just want to point out, I mean, both these are done by James Reynolds, actually the first Surveyor General of Bengal. The one on the far right actually is from the Atlas of Useful Knowledge, where I believe that the rivers have actually been hung out to dry, as it were, and today many of them are dry. As in Egypt, scholars have long found their wonder neither shared nor understood by locals. Like their Egyptian counterparts, locals here saw and continue to see a thick hydrological surface, which they call with names like Sindhu, Ganga, etc. Names which are unfortunately associated today more with religion and geography than with hydrology. Now, if these locals wondered at all, it must surely have been at the line drawn by academics to call out a river, a line that did not just define a flow, it also defined flood. For flood is nothing more than water crossing a drawn line. Now, the Trigonometric Survey of India, the GTS, begun in 1800 by William Lambton, would mark river channels more definitely than ever before. This geodesic effort would put an end to speculation over the geographic shape and size of South Asia, but it would also confirm the backdrop of our understanding of this region as divided between land and water, brown and blue. On this geographic surface, which features today in all textbooks, events occur, boundaries are inscribed and erased, dynasties come and go, people, flora and fauna live and migrate, cultures form and disperse, rivers flow, change course and flood. Now, this South Asia is a space constructed out of a moment in time, a fictitious moment in the hydrological cycle when water is assumed to be somewhere confined behind lines. Yet the simplistic geographic surface is the taken for granted ground on which history is written, however controversially, the present is described and visions are conceived. It is also the ground on which we see habitat in terms of settlement, nomadic, rural, and urban, a hierarchical sequence that culminates in the city across space and time. Now, settlement thinking is not surprising on a geographic surface, given that the idea of settlement stems from the river, from the observation famously made by Herodotus that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Evidently, the Nile to him was not just water separate from land. It carried silt that settled to make ground. This settled plain contrasts with the unsettled ground all around, the shifting sands of the desert, the eroding slopes of mountains, the salt marshes of the sea. These grounds belonged not to the river, but to nobody or the nomad, who did not just live an unsettled life, he inhabited an unsettled ground. And that, I believe, is actually a definition of the nomad that should be embraced, actually, a person who occupies a shifting landscape. The river, though, did not stop at making the settled ground of human settlement. It goes on to make the ground of the city, a settlement of surplus density, non-agrarian specializations, monumental buildings, literacy, predictive sciences, sophisticated infrastructure, conceptualized art, etc. Add to this the river's dependable source of water and access to places at a distance, even across the seas, for trade and exchange, and cities become exotic places and centers of newness and innovation, sites of an urbanity that is the envy and aspiration that drives urbanization. Now, today, rivers extend their reach far beyond the alluvial plain, settling formerly unsettled ground, such as greening deserts, stabilizing mountains, and filling the sea, but also urbanizing lesser settlements in a trajectory that should come as no surprise. All the while, its presence in maps, texts, plans, disciplines, everyday conversations, indeed the cultivated eye, reinforces the geographic surface of its birth, a surface divided between land and water, but furthermore between settled and unsettled, urban and rural, kacha and pakka. Have we been limited by river imagining and river imaging to framing problems, policies, opportunities, and design interventions by one moment in the hydrological cycle? What is South Asia as a hydrological surface? What possibilities does it open up? What I want to actually now share with you are just 3 landscapes that we have looked into. The first one, perhaps a little less, but we have reflected on it, which is the Sabarmati Plain, the Mumbai Estuary, and the Deccan Plateau. And I want to suggest, actually, that when we design here, we would like to see ourselves designing in a rain terrain and not in a river landscape. And these landscapes will also show you the fact that India is a rain terrain. Or I would extend that to South Asia as a rain terrain rather than a river-driven landscape. So to begin with the Sabarmati Plain, you would all know the Sabarmati, of course, as a place, as the river of Ahmedabad. For a moment, I want to suspend the thought of it being a river, although it is hard to. But what you see on the left is a picture that we took in 2004 when we visited over there. It was a pretty dry riverbed, as a surveyor would call it. And then we went a few years later, and we saw what you see on the right. Water comes in, and this riverbed becomes a river. Now, people are tired of seeing this image of a riverbed, and it doesn't fulfill their image of a river. So they want a river. But in order to want a river, they first want a riverfront. I mean, there's a reason why they're going after a river. They want a riverfront. Riverfronts are lucrative places. I mean, and already this riverfront has been sold to people all across the world, including China, Korea, and places like that. But this is the construction that we saw going on in 2006 when we were there. And it's an amazing investment, actually, in constructing a riverfront. You see the project drawings in the middle channel, and you see the final project actually emerging in the lower threesome. But when you have a riverfront, you've got to have a river. So how did you actually get a river? This is a drawing of Gujarat and Western India. This is the Sabarmati that comes down, the Sabarmati River, so-called, that ends in this gulf here. And this is the Narmada River, which is, of course, infamous for its dams and has caused the World Bank a lot of trouble, at least, in their funding of dams. But what you see over here in red is a channel that runs up here all the way to the Sabarmati. And it siphons under all these channels. There you see it actually leaving the dam and siphoning under all the rivers that it crosses until it comes to the Sabarmati. When it comes to the Sabarmati, there is an outlet here. And if you notice, the Sabarmati is wet below and dry above. It's wet below and dry above. This channel undoubtedly is listed as an agricultural channel for agricultural settlements. But here it is being used to actually draw in what can ultimately only be stagnant water in a river. So this has become a lake in order to construct a riverfront over here. So the notion of rivers, I mean, is so deeply embedded in our imagination that we can't bear the sight of a river bed. I mean, I don't know how many of you have been in a train in India, but we did a lot as children. And we often went, when the train crossed a river, the sound of the train changed. You went the dun, 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 because you were going on a metal bridge, and we would all look out, and then we would ask our parents, what are we, where are we? And then they would say, we're crossing a river. And then we would look out and say, but where's the water? And then they would get into this extended hydrological lesson about how water will come, and when it will come, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea of a dry riverbed is sort of sort of fixed in our imagination. Now, what I want to suggest is that you would only see a riverbed if you saw riverbanks. If you did not see riverbanks, you don't see a riverbed. So if you saw a plain, actually, through which water just came once in a while, but there were also other inhabitants that came, including goats, including the dhobis, including the dyers. I mean, these are images actually taken by Cartier-Bresson, the middle row over there, and the Gujari came to this plain. So as a surface, it opened itself in multiple ways to multiple inhabitants. You know, when you draw lines of riverbank, then that becomes a place of water alone. But Gandhi gathered on the Sabarmati. You know, I mean, this is where he began his salt march. You know, did he see it as a river? Or did he see it as a plain that extended from his ashram over here? You know, and he was actually forbidden at this time to gather in the public places in Ahmedabad. So what he did was gather on the Sabarmati, because that was not under any land use, designated land use, as it were. And so this is where, you know, he would exercise his resistance. The way I see it was he was resisting the notion of river in the first place. So what we have over here is really a Sabarmati plain appreciation of a ground versus the appreciation of a river. Here, when water comes, it comes and it passes through, and you have other inhabitants that come through. What you're going to see in Ahmedabad is one thing alone, and that is a riverfront. I mean, there is a lot of, I mean, today, amazing number of cities in India are all following the example of Ahmedabad. This is, you know, a success story. Even if you've got a lake, if you've got a little puddle, you want a waterfront. You know, and so this idea of a waterfront, of confronting water, water beyond a line is, you know, is with us to stay. So this is just, you know, by way of critique and exposure. I want to take you through to another landscape now in South India, which is located, which is basically around Bangalore, which we investigated in, you know, between around beginning 2000 to 2004. But I want to begin with the triangulation that I just showed you. This is the GTS, the Trigonometrical Survey of India, the survey that ultimately fixed all the lines that you see in your maps, you know, and textbooks and history books, and any map that is called to your imagination. Any child that you ask, draw India, they will draw a line like that, you know. I mean, it's amazing. But this is where it stems from, is the GTS, which took 90 years to construct. But if you know this, the history is fascinating. It began in Bangalore in the year 1800 when William Lambton laid out a baseline over here, and then he went across the peninsula. But at some point, he was disturbed. And I'll tell you why he was disturbed. The measurement was disturbed, and he had to begin again, and he began again in Madras in 1802. And the Survey of India only recognizes that second start. They don't recognize that first start. And I want to tell you why they don't recognize that first start. I recognize it as a start. But this is the baseline that he measured across 7 miles of Bangalore, across the former international airport in Bangalore. But I must maybe say a word or two about triangulation. Actually, it's an amazing system of surveying that was doing two things. It was actually drawing the boundary lines of India, locating places and points of permanence, but it was also measuring the curvature of the earth. And the first measure of the curvature of the earth was done in Ecuador, or what was Peru at that time, by La Condamine, this French team, who led a French team over there in the 1740s. So this followed, I would say, soon after. It was about the 6th or 7th baseline on the surface of the earth. And why they were doing it was they wanted to verify whether the earth was an oblate spheroid or a prolate spheroid. And once they got into the fact that it was an oblate spheroid, they had to measure the curve on all parts of the surface, because they did not quite know what precisely the shape was. So this was the construction of what is known as the Everest spheroid. But it begins actually with the baseline. It's the only thing that you measure. Then after that, you move from point to point to point to point, and you basically compute. You don't basically measure after that. You work trigonometrically, and then at the end, you do another baseline, and then you compared basically your computed distance measurement of that baseline against the measured baseline, and you found basically an error. And that error was almost insignificant. I mean, it was like an inch, you know, or less actually at the time. And we're talking late 1700s, early 1800s. So it was remarkable actually, and all hinged on the measurement of that baseline. So that's all I want to dwell on over here, is the significance of this baseline that went in Bangalore from there to there. And what disturbed it was a tank. When Lambton says the rains came, and he never expected water to disrupt his baseline. So he had laid these pickets out, you know, and level ground, and here water comes and throws him off, you know. And so we read this actually, and we said, now what tank is this? What tank? And we found this tank. This tank is Belandur. I mean, I'm calling it a tank. It's a reservoir. It's a reservoir. And it basically came in the way. So he was forced to triangulate around, and he could not accommodate this error. You see, this is now, he's measuring the surface of the earth. You see, it's a grand project for the Royal Society. And so he had to start again from Madras. But what this does is that it reveals a landscape that is fascinating. It reveals a system of reservoirs. And these reservoirs have been constructed over centuries to collect rain in a place where there are no rivers. There's no known river in Bangalore. So this was a water system. Those of you familiar with it, this is Alsu Lake, which I've sort of highlighted over here, because part of this was the meridian. This was the whole meridian, was like equivalent to the Greenwich meridian. But the idea here is that this Belandur tank is one of the last tanks actually it drains the water of a number of tanks actually into a system further down. So it's a basic system of the Deccan Plateau. But these tanks fascinated us, and I'm calling them tanks, because that's the way in which you refer to them. In Kannada, you call them kere. But if you were to look at a Google today, this is what you might see. It's actually made by a bund, an earthen embankment like that holds water on one side. And this water actually flows off a system from a previous tank. So there's an overflow system over here, and there is a plug in the middle. I can raise that plug and water the fields below, or I can actually accommodate an overflow that then follows into the next tank and then so on. It's a remarkable system. And this is actually a drawing by Cornwallis's army in 1791 when he came in to attack Tipu Sultan. But this is Bangalore. This is the bound hedge of Bangalore. And they drew, and it takes only an army actually to recognize tanks like this and low grounds. But they recognize a whole system of low grounds, if you notice. They didn't recognize tanks alone. They recognized bunds across low grounds. So it was actually a fantastic observation that they had made, but they lost very quickly. The idea then is that these embankments hold water, and they hold rainwater coming off a surface. And this is basically a bed of clay. This is a bed of clay. So this is not pervious thing. So water is not going to go into the ground. It is just held there for use. And it is held against these embankments. But what you see over here are actually, you see a tank system when the water is full, as it were. And here you see the agency that makes it, or you see it at another time in the year when there is no water, and you only see the embankments, or the worms, as we like to call this particular map. The embankments that actually hold water. Now, the British love to see it actually as a hierarchical system. That you have the biggest, so you have the biggest tank here that takes in smaller tanks and smaller tanks and smaller tanks and so on. So basically, it's small to big. We saw it differently. We see it as actually what we call, series and parallels. This tank, which you see over here, which is the Ramsagar tank, is basically, this whole land is called Land of 1,000 Tanks, and that's the 1,000th tank over there. Now, this tank actually draws the overflows of this tank that you see here. Now, this tank draws the overflows of another that you see there. But then I can go in any direction. My overflow system comes from multiple directions. And if I know that my system depends on overflows, I better be friends with these guys, otherwise I'm not going to get any water. So it's an intrinsically political system that actually maintains relationships of villages that were associated with each tank, and constructs a ground that is not one so much of dependency, actually, but of a network, of a system of network and choices. So basically, alliances were constructed on the grounds of series parallels. So you can't really call it a hierarchical system. It's a lot more muddy, let us say, and allows for a political system that, of course, the British couldn't entertain. But the wonderful thing about the tanks is that they run dry. They run dry at some point in time. And we actually documented this to the Ganesh festival, which is occurring as we speak, as it were, I think. But this is one of the tanks where the clay is taken from the tank bed, made into the idol, basically the puja, etc., of the Ganesh. And the Ganesh festival occurs, and then the rains have come in the meantime, and then the idol is immersed in the tank now that is full, with the idea that water will come back in the next year. But then the tank runs dry, and then you have the clay to make the idol again, and so on and so forth. This is peculiarly Bangalore, even though Ganesh is not a festival actually that emerged here. It emerged in Bombay as a political festival, but it's sort of been adopted by this landscape in this peculiar way, recognizing the seasonality of tanks. So what you see actually is a system here, that is wet and dry, where there's cultivation that occurs, where clay is used actually for bricks, etc., etc. But the system is a temporal system. It's not a spatial system. It is not something that I can draw with lines. It's not something that I can draw with a spatial line, at least. So that temporality actually is something that creates much more of a complex ground of use. I can't label this at any use, like recreation, for example, because I can get temporary housing over there, or I can have a hospital there at some point, or I can, things like that actually can be considered temporary for at least a span. But of course, we don't tend to see it like that today. People in Bangalore love to call these lakes. And if you see the, city of gardens, lakes, opportunities, and whatever, I mean, that list sort of extends, Bangalore loves these names. But the idea then which is a result of mapping. Maps have made them blue. And they've actually broken them apart, broken the system, and actually constructed these isolated grounds. So what you see actually is this. We found this in the forest department in Bangalore, where there is this whole initiative by the Rotary Club to revive the lakes of Bangalore. Preserve lakes, plant trees, keep Bangalore clean and green. Do you recognize the image? Isn't that an amazing coniferous Swiss kind of ground for a place of, in a latitude of 12 degrees? I mean, this is the aspiration. This speaks to the aspirations of people, and the idea that lakes and lake systems, which are really, flow systems in another way, that are encouraged. But this is what we are seeing today, where they're becoming gated communities, actually, privileged places of fenced off for boating in the city. Or you have bird watchers who want to keep these as perennial water bodies because they believe that the birds come. Birds did come, but they were temporal birds, that went with temporal landscapes, So the idea here of actually now conserving it only for birds, taking it out of a system, is something that we have been trying to fight in Bangalore for the last, 5-6 years. And people are now beginning to see this, because what this really encourages is a stagnant water body, like the Sabarmati. This is water that goes nowhere. They pretend that it is going to feed the aquifers. This is a clay base. This water is going nowhere. It doesn't go into the aquifers. The water that is being drawn out of the aquifers of Bangalore is the waters of the Ice Age. Waters of the Ice Age. It's being drawn from 900 meters below the surface. I mean, that's what we have reached today. So the idea that this is going to replenish aquifers at 900 meters is one of the biggest bluffs that is actually being perpetrated by ecologists, if you will. So the idea here, we need something a lot more radical in terms of actually accommodating rain rather than rivers. But the idea here of Bangalore becoming this enclosed entity, and the garden city fuels this idea of contained things, and the idea of containing lakes, containing gardens, containing the city as a garden city is all part of that same mindset and imagination of river thinking, is what I would like to call it. But now, this is an amazing thing, that even when a place is not on a river, the river comes to the place. And so over here, you have the Kaveri, and Bangalore is here. It's basically it's about, Bangalore is 3,000 feet. This is Shivsamudram Falls over here, which is about 2,000 feet. So the water is being pumped up to Bangalore, actually by pipelines that you see over here. So we have 90 miles of pipelines. And then you have the sewage of Bangalore, at least half of Bangalore, coming down, what is first the Vishwabharati, then the Arkavati, down back to the Kaveri. We call this the fourth island of the Kaveri, after Shivsamudram, Srirangapatnam, and Srirangam. This is the fourth island. It's a peculiar island, if you will, where water circumscribes it and then goes down and goes up as clean and comes back as sewage. And all these people over here are basically left without water. Because look at this. This is the Kaveri. When we visited it, there was no water in it because all the water is going to Bangalore. So it is just a river of rock. It's just a river of rock. So when the Kaveri dispute is occurring between Tamil Nadu and this thing, you sometimes wonder what water they're fighting over. It's just that momentary water of the monsoon that is being scrapped over, because otherwise, there is no water for most of the year in this time. So the point is that we are now torn between a geographic surface and a hydrological surface. And it's the geographic surface that reigns as the garden city and provides us the imagination for planning, and to some extent history, because most of the books that are written on history refer to Bangalore as a garden city. They don't see it actually as a plateau that is actually defined more by its tank system and bund system. I want to move to a third landscape, and that is in Mumbai, which is, as you know, on the sea. The question really is, how do we accommodate the sea? And the sea ultimately is what rivers generally open onto, and the line of the river continues as the line of the coast. And that intrigued us, and we followed actually the drawing of the coastline, which every child today draws with such ease as a barrier there, began in this porosity of the Potalan chart, in the 1500s, and actually ended up, with much more of a firm line that we draw, as a coastline, And this was when it was finally drawn by a surveyor in 1786. The first drawing actually that was measured. And if you ask the question, how do you draw a line of the coast? I mean, this is the question I asked you earlier. Can you divide land from water? But then when I show you the landscapes that it goes through, you'll be even more amazed. But the idea then of Bombay being this island outside of, the coastline of India was a constructed reality. I cannot get into the history of this, but the Portuguese were so unsettled by the idea that people could cross over, because they already, basically, the Portuguese wanted them to take only this much. The British, I must step back. The British handed over the Portuguese, basically the island of Bombay in 1661 as dowry. And this was to, I think, Queen Isabella to King Charles II. In 1661. And what was given to them was this. What the Portuguese believed was this much. The British took that much. And the idea of them taking more than they were given was justified on the basis that they could walk there. And you see, they walked in low tide, they say. They walked in low tide. And so the Portuguese were looking at high tide, these guys were looking at low tide, and then then you find the Portuguese viceroy, writing to his king saying, beware of these British because they might walk to the mainland and take the mainland. And that's what they did eventually. They walked to the mainland and took the mainland. So this is what the 1827 was the first drawing, really, the survey map of Bombay and Salsette, the larger island. I mean, and, I can get into the story, the fictitious ground of 6-7 islands, and things like that actually just don't hold. It's all a fiction that was constructed at some point. And today, every taxi driver, I mean, it's interesting. You tell them you're studying Bombay, they say, do you know the story of 7 islands? We say that, but they're not 7 islands. They're like 150 islands. How do you choose 7? And it's one of those things that. But this is the landscape that you're drawing a line through. Can you draw a line through the salt pans, through the beach, through steps, through the mangroves? How do you do that? I mean, and then you realize that it is not the line that, I mean, it's not basically the land that precedes the line. The line precedes the land. So I draw the line, and boy, everybody races towards it and fills up the ground till they basically come up to the line. And that's what they did with the mangroves. They are the badlands. This is the image that you have on your screen. But the idea here is that it is not just the sea. I must mention one thing, though. The idea of drawing a line is also to confront the sea, that you actually place the sea beyond an edge. That idea of actually making water there, land here, the act of separating it is something that people have done materially for years. But there's always been that fluidity and practices that have operated in the fluidity of this exchange of land and water. But what we see today, is this firm line actually that keeps the sea there, land here, and everything else actually is destroyed in the gradient between land and sea. But then you also keep the monsoon out. I mean, today, basically, the monsoon is an enemy. It began as a visitor, began a visitor that comes, visits Bombay, and then goes on. Today it's an unwanted visitor because in 2005 it basically dropped 900 of rain in Bombay and flooded much of it. That's how we sort of got into this particular project. But we are very disturbed by the idea that the monsoon has become an enemy over here. I mean, and there are publications that are made every year. In fact, the American embassy warns visitors over there, don't go on certain days. And then the government over there provides, saying carry a hammer in the car, you can break your window, if the water comes up, I mean, it's like you're arming people for the monsoon, and that sense actually of the unwanted monsoon is something that is very, very disturbing, So rain is not only a guest because of the river that has made its ground, it's also an unwanted one. But this, if you notice, there are two lines here. The dark blue and the light blue. This were the mangroves. And all this is the Bandra Kulla complex, if you know Bombay. This is Dharavi, which has actually occupied all this. So all the mangroves have gone, really, to the filling, primarily because of the line that was drawn. But also water is contained. I mean, can you do this in Bombay during the monsoon? Would a surveyor have the guts to go out to survey in the monsoon? When water is everywhere, you don't see any lines. How do you actually draw your line? So it's incredible, actually, that this fiction has continued. But this is a wonderful fiction, and we sort of love it. But this is the fattening of Bombay and the fattening of land. We shouldn't be surprised, that it's occupying basically the land up to which the surveyor has made affordable, as it were, accessible. But this is the disaster that we got into Bombay with, this cloud that sat over this part of Bombay and shed 900 when only 72 fell here. So for us, it was a challenge of probability analysis too, which all planners work by. They say that this is a 50-year flood, this is a 100-year flood. This particular one was a 500-year flood. But we would tell them, but it might happen tomorrow. It doesn't mean it's going to happen after 500. Believe me, this is what they really think. That's a 500-year flood. It'll happen after 500 years again, And so this sense of probability analysis is not so much actually, in the minds of these people. It's actually manifest in the constructions of the ground. And so you find that they found a culprit over here, and they have actually channeled this water because they say that it was filled with carcasses of buffaloes, this, that, and the rest of it, But the idea of it being contained within a certain channel, is something that we have to. What time is it? Am I running out? Oh, okay. I should hurry up. But the idea here of a channel that is of a certain width that can accommodate a flood of a particular time is something that is ingrained in in the mindset of designers, and they plan for it like this. So they are designing rivers today. And that is another very disturbing trend. It's not this that we are we have rivers in our imagination. We are designing new ones as we sort of move along. So what we did was actually change the ground of Mumbai from looking at a plan where you see rivers actually and lines in plan to actually looking at things sectionally where you tend to see soak, where you tend to see saturation, where you tend to see overflows. I'm just going to race through some of these projects. I'm sorry, I've crossed over my limit. But some of these projects actually use the section to invoke actually place rather than use plan to invoke place. So these things don't make sense in plan. They actually juxtapose areas that we thought were significant against one another and actually constructed movements through places that then allowed for practices to emerge. And practices that actually cultivated water and the edge much more dynamically than they would with a finite river. So we started with photo works that brought places out and then sectioned them and then worked with possibilities. And so you work in an estuary with multiple possibilities. You don't work with master plans. You work with fluidities. You work with flexibility and so on. So that was one. I just take you through another project. This is the Mahim Fort, where a number of poor people live in the fort. 3,000 families, in fact, live in there. with the beach, et cetera, et cetera. But again, we followed that same procedure. But the point here was that rather than to have measures of probability, what we did is we worked with practices on notation systems, wherein each landscape actually was devised by certain time. And we basically say this, that many people say that there's no space in Bombay. We say there's a lot of space in time. So the sense of temporality of landscapes is for us the temporality of rain, rather than a river. River thinking, there's a perennial sense to the river and the lines that are drawn in the ground, whereas rain actually is accommodating of time in a different way. Okay. So Mumbai and an estuary, the distinction between Bombay Island and Mumbai estuary. Our whole point was, we said, why do we design an island? Why are we designing Bombay as an island? Why can't we look at Bombay as an estuary and allow for that flexibility and contradictions, et cetera, and complexity? Our work actually then manifests itself in exhibitions. We believe that we educate people, exchange ideas with them, and we believe that we put forth something that's not always, doesn't have to be God's word, as it were, but then we interact with various sections of the public, and that has been exciting both in Bangalore and in Bombay. But the idea that we introduce something as a design possibility and then have a discussion on it is for us very important, because otherwise we are only talking a theoretical shift, as it were. So just to end, for well over 2 millennia, South Asia has been seen as a geographic surface, a land drained by rivers, a subcontinent where water is presumed to be somewhere, a place where people are encouraged, if not made, to settle, live in settlements and aspire to the quintessential settlement, the city. It is not surprising that rivers have become what they were always imagined and imaged to be on this surface, drains. And it is not surprising that urbanization in South Asia is accelerating. It should be expected on a geographic surface. If rivers and cities have problems today, then we surely undermine any solution with the imagination that is steeped in this very same geographic surface. We can, however, step off a geographic surface onto a hydrological one. We can move away from seeing water somewhere to seeing waters everywhere, from seeing humans settling on land separated from water to seeing them anchoring in a surface of wetness. For this, we need to see rivers for what they are, simplistic abstractions that we have tried to make real for 2,500 years. We need to re-articulate the past without rivers, and the river imagination that leads us inevitably to origins on rivers. We need to instead re-articulate the past, describe the present, and envision the future with a hydrological imagination that comes with a monsoon wind. In its reign is a new beginning. Thank you. Yeah.
Can we turn the lights up? Dilip is willing to take questions.
Will.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I loved it. And I mean, I do come a bit out of a design background, so I don't know how many other people noticed it, but your images were just extraordinary, and not just the ones that you and your partner composed, but your selection of archival and whatnot. That really, I just want to say I appreciated that part of the talk a lot. And I sort of feel now like I'm going to, sign up for your team and get out and proselytize a bit. But I wonder what you found to be, now you talked a bit just at the end about your exhibitions and your strategy of actually proposing something as a way to actually talk concretely, as a sort of step towards changing people's ways of thinking, if you will. I wonder what you found to be a success. What sorts of successful strategies have you developed over time to get people to at least stop for a moment and reflect on their assumptions about the geographic surface?
I mean, to some extent, actually, couching it as a geographic surface is something relatively, it's something that we sort of come to after Bombay. I mean, what we were doing initially, I mean, like in the Bangalore project, I mean, it was much broader. It was much broader. I mean, water was one portion of it. We also looked at plants, we looked at things, we looked at on open terrain versus a closed entity, let us say. But that doesn't distract from the question that you asked, because I think that, I mean, if you know, we have tried very hard actually during the exhibition, for example, you know, not only to bring people of various kinds, you know, from administrators to teachers to children, you know, and we take them around on walks. I mean, like in Bombay, I think I did, you know, hundreds of walkthroughs, you know, with the chief minister, with the, you know, with the planning commissioner, you know, with school children, you know, and with school teachers, and I think it was all very exciting. We also walked them to the field. I took the planning commissioner on a walk to this Mahim fort that I show over here, and it's a place that he had never been to. And it's amazing, the parts of Bombay that we have visited, no planner has even been to, you know, and it's really surprising. So we sort of open up landscapes to them, you know, from, but having said that, you know, it's a very strange time in India. You know, as much as we want to portray an alternative, you know, there are other alternatives. It's like with the chief engineer, you know, the planning commissioner was very impressed, say, with the Bombay project, and he said, can we implement one or two? The industrialists also, by the way, were behind us, you know, wanting to implement. And of course, it's a bit of a scary nexus, you know, when you get into things like that, and we're not sort of, you know, as academics, and we're a little uncomfortable with this whole thing. So we are sort of navigating it on a bed of thorns, as it were. But I was talking to the chief engineer of Bombay, of MMRDA, and I'm telling him about the monsoon. I mean, it was raining cats and dogs outside, you know, and I'm saying that, you know, okay, we are looking at it's a project I didn't show you, but a contour trench along the national park that would actually draw water in to a trench that could be used, but could also work as a boundary between the park and the city, and a very exciting possibility actually for the culture of the city, you know, and its integration, you know, all kinds of integration between leopard and dog, and, you know, I mean, there's a lot of battling going on between nature and culture over there. But after I finished, after 1 hour, and he said, okay, you know, you go this thing, that thing, that. He then, as I'm leaving, he says, do you know anything about desalination? You know, and then I said, but why do you want to know about desalination? He said, no, you know, it's a very good system of water. I said, but you have this monsoon. You know, so it's this, it's a funny, you know, I mean, we have our, you know, we make efforts, you know, as it were, and we've had workshops also, you know, we've actually had workshops with students of architecture. We try to construct a movement. I feel that is where we're the most successful in a way, where we try to instigate a particular population into things. We were sort of less successful in Bangalore than we were in Bombay, but in Bangalore now, architects are waking up, you know, to it, and we've written a manifesto for them, you know, because they wanted to write an opposition to the city, and we said, architects don't write, you do. You know, why don't you act? You know, produce an alternative. So we're working with them to produce an alternative, and so we've gathered them around this imagination, actually. But, you know, unfortunately, our work is recognized only in crisis. And that is the sad part. And it's true to some extent, our work on Mississippi and Bangalore and Bombay responded to crisis situations. And in crisis, nobody's listening very hard, you know, I mean, and they think, until, you know, it has passed. It's like New Orleans, we could not enter sideways because it was, you know, it was so tragic. Nobody wanted a new idea, you know, they just wanted to get back, you know, on their feet. So we kept away, you know, and, yeah, so I don't know if that's an answer really, you know, Will, but, you know, we try, let's say, you know, we muddle through.
I really like the idea that you presented, especially because it really shows that the ideology that you're coming from is very different from what is thought like especially in South Asia. However, there's this conflict that you describe between land and water. But what about the conflict between water and water, especially when you look at it from a transnational perspective? Would you ever, I mean, I know you don't want to, I would say, swim in the dangerous waters of politics, but this is something that is very, very crucial in South Asia.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
thank you
Yeah.
so much. Sorry.
Yeah, I thought my voice was loud enough. No, it's a good question. No, I mean, it's not that we hesitate to swim in politics. On the contrary, we welcome it. But the way we see it actually is that much of politics is driven actually by the divisions of water. I mean, if you think of India, Pakistan, or if you look at what is happening between China and India today, you know, it's the possession of waters, and it's the waters in line that is being possessed. And one of the things that we are suggesting is that you contain water, you hold water. Now, of course, immediately you get into the question of big dams because, everybody's looking at rivers. But if you look at surfaces and you look at the gathering of water actually in multiplicity, like you see in Bangalore, that's possible. I mean, I believe that was the language of India. I mean, that Ganga even was the last overflow, as it were. And as the last overflow, it's still allowed for cultivation on its sides. Even today, you would find cultivation, that follows the river as it narrows and recedes, back. And that's something amazing to see. You won't see that anywhere else. But to answer your question, I mean, I think that much of the conflict between water and water comes because of drawn lines. And in fact, that is the subject of our next work. I mean, our next book is called, The Invention of Rivers, Alexander's Eye and Ganga's Descent. But the idea here is that rivers have been a source of conflict. Amazing conflict like, between states, et cetera, but it is actually contained waters that are a source. It's when you commodify. It's like between Turkey and Iraq. I mean, Turkey just told, when it shut off the water to fill up the Ataturk Dam, they shut water in the Euphrates for 1 week. There was no water in the Euphrates. I mean, this is supposed to be a cradle of civilization. There was no water. But they told Iraq, you take care of oil, we'll take care of water. I mean, so that sense actually of controlling a commodity comes really from the drawing of lines and this thing. And so what we say is turn to rain. Makes sense. Not that there will not be any politics there. If people are seeding clouds, you might get into another thing. But certainly it at least allows for more of an opportunity in.
But isn't contained rainwater kind of the same thing as a dammed body of water? I mean, it's controlled by somebody. It's lined water.
That's true. I mean, but what we believe, at least in the case of the Bangalore, when you actually build those bunds, I mean, there's a distinction between the bunds and the dam. I mean, only because of the larger system, which I cannot get into now. But the idea that you contain as much, you don't draw in plan that line that we drew, in fact, at that time. We know better today, perhaps. But the idea is that you actually increase depth and section. But it is, as with all water, once you commodify, you commodify. You can commodify rainwater too. And one of the things that we find most disturbing about rainwater harvesting schemes today is that it is talking about the same water harvested as rain. And so there's a lot more that has to change. And that to some extent is what the book is about actually, is about the belief systems when it comes to course, source, and flood. 3 ideas. The belief systems that reinforce these 3 actually is incredible through history. And we have to dismantle that whole thing. And it's really been rivers that has fueled it. I'm sorry, I'm moving away from here. It's rivers that have fueled that kind of thinking. So I would like to think that rain can be thought about outside of the river paradigm. It's when you bring it into the river paradigm that I'm being a bit of an idealist here, I guess, but but this is something that I want to carry forth. Sorry.
That's right.
Just following up on that, I was curious about the characterization of and these kinds of products they're potentially surprising and illuminating to see a landscape described this way. But then you move into the politics and you wonder, is it people, and you talk about lines being formed by, first comes the line, then comes the land, and how much is it really about new ways of conceptualizing stuff, and how is the fact that all this stuff, lines are good for political control of various large-scale kinds of things, political products people want. These, like the smaller scale rainwater catching, doesn't allow those kinds of political projects. So how much is it really about changing people's imagination or changing people's belief systems, as you put it, and how much is it about really that's kind of irrelevant? I mean, this gets back to a classic question of social theory, like how important are these ideas? Are these ideas really driven because they actually are useful for control of various kinds of different scales of political systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is certainly, 2,500 years of river thinking. I mean, and I see that many of the lines that have evolved from the river into political boundaries, I think I don't want to actually draw a very, a causal line there, with clarity. But there certainly is a mindset that comes with actually this division. Like we say, for example, when Heraclitus when Heraclitus drew attention to the river as ever flowing, and never stand, he said, you can't step in the same river twice. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, philosophers take issue with it, I mean, you say, I mean, what did he really mean? Did he mean change? Did he mean ordered change? Did he mean, But nobody thinks that he actually had already divided land from water. I mean, that he made this assumption in his time already of this divide, that the line is taken for granted. And one can then argue its entry into politics in terms of this thing. I mean, even nationhoods. I mean, I think it's a very recent phenomena that way. But I think what you are raising actually is a good question, which we want to actually take on as an ambition, that we really don't know what hangs off rivers. But we also don't know what can hang off rain. And our belief is that if we release rain from the river paradigm into complexity thinking of its own kind, perhaps we might see another kind of politics. Perhaps we might see another kind of relational ground emerging. I don't know what this would be, but what we are keen to do is only open that as a ground of dialogue. No one has actually raised a question actually about the river being a construct. It is just so taken for granted in all disciplines as a natural entity, that everybody must see, as it were, or everyone is educated to see. And I feel certain that even today there are populations in the world that don't see rivers. They just work with rain and overflow systems. So I don't know really where. I mean, I'd love to speculate, and maybe that's where we are now, into speculating what possibilities might arise from rain. But like we've done with these other projects, we might just put something on the table and see what people respond with. They might come up with ideas that rain can do this and rain can do that, and that rivers have never been able to do. So it's more the speculative, I guess, that we are interested in, opening up.
Lee had a question, and then maybe Tom. Lee, would you wait for the microphone?
I just want to speculate just a bit further. You're making an argument against drawing lines, against distinctions, trying to look beyond what we take for granted by seeing rivers as natural. And yet you seem to be taking water for granted and water as natural, even though your arguments about the plateau and the estuary seem to suggest that maybe in the next stage we shouldn't think about a distinction between solid and liquid or land and water. I can understand heuristically why you might have to make this distinction, argue against it, but as you're proposing going beyond it categorically, you seem to be stuck on rain, which seems at least ironic, if not unrealistic, for a part of the world where for 9 months of the year there is none.
Yeah. I mean,
So I'm wondering, that's one question. I'm wondering I understand, I think, conceptually what you're trying to do, and yet I don't know why you're focusing much more on the rain than on something which transcends that distinction between the water and the non-water.
I would like to think actually that when we talk of a rain, we don't talk of rain per se, we talk of rain terrain. And so it is not about the water as such, but it is about actually a terrain that is driven by rain as a phenomenon. Now, having said that, you raise an interesting question, because we struggle with this actually, of trying to maintain this divide actually as an elemental divide that the school of Miletus actually embraced as an elemental divide. And there's no saying actually that same divide was a material divide in that manner actually when the folks in India described, the earth, water, air, etc., their elemental distinction. But just to put forth a thought on how we think of, say, the Nile. Now, the Nile, they built actually, any historian will tell you that the Nilometer is a piece of architecture that was built on the Nile actually to measure the depth of water, they say. Now, we would say that, was it there to measure the depth of water, or was it there to measure depth of silty soil? Because there is no such thing as water. There's only more muddy water and less muddy water, and more solid and less solid. And to some extent, that is what we sort of imply by wetness, that when actually the ground soaks and you have an overflow, it is not necessarily water that overflows, it is stuff that overflows, and that stuff is what you gather for your silt and your thing. So to think actually that the nilometer was measuring actually the richness of wetness rather than water in a land, I think is where we would like to go and sort of extend this sort of concept. So when we look at rain terrain, actually, as opposed to the thing, we're looking at actually this sense of muddiness that actually extends by overflows rather than by H2O, as it were, as an extracted element. So the distinctions are less firm in my mind, actually, when we look at an overflow structure as opposed to a flow structure. But I understand your point very well, I think, in terms of the contradiction that it can lead to, because this is something. I mean, we had a conference at Penn, actually, called the Terrain of Water, and we got trapped in this precisely. That, I mean, you want to get away from water as a commodity, but you can't get away from water because just in the word water, you're already commodifying. You're already commodifying an element. So it is a difficulty which I sort of appreciate.
Tom, you had a question?
Yeah, I love this talk and the new ways of thinking and suggest. So thank you very much for that. I just wanted to ask, on the side of the wrong way of thinking, the geographical way, there's a very rich history. It goes way back to Miletus. Famous people are mentioned by name. It becomes institutionalized and entrenched. But hydrology comes out of nowhere as therapy for the wrongness of this way of thinking. And I'm just wondering, as a newcomer to this topic, where hydrology comes from.
That's good. I mean, it's another logic,
Location? Is it? You make it sound as if it's insurgent and new and I don't know, miraculous somehow.
I mean, it's a good question, and maybe I use the word hydrology with a little, with a sense of only to compete with geography, as it were. But if you look at some of the conversations in history that have searched for the sources of rivers, or that have searched for the destination of rivers, and how the origin of springs are served by, does it come from rain, or does it come through the earth? There's a wonderful mystery in hydrology that is entertained in hydrological discourse that is not entertained in geographic discourse, and so that sense, because of the mysteriousness of the earth. So we have used hydrology, I mean, as a field and as a thinking to call attention to two things. One is actually this other extended field that has struggled with a more mysterious ground and has not quite come to terms with it. But we also use it as a term to overcome this surface of the earth idea of geography and institute a depth, because hydrology deals with the depth of the earth and the sky, and that sense of this circling. I mean, having said that, I realize that hydrology comes with simplistic, assumptions to some extent, even like the hydrological cycle is a simplified reading actually of water. But every time a hydrologist says this, there's always an apology, for reduction of I don't find that apology in geography at all. Yeah.
Dick.
Well, that will lead to my question. But first, let me add another angle of thanks for choosing the University of Michigan for at least one day over Penn. I appreciate it. We all greatly do.
I'm feeling relieved.
And specifically, thanks for opening this semester's discussion of environmental issues in the subcontinent, because the three speakers who are coming in on the 16th of November, all in one way or another, are going to be feeding off the discussion that you've begun this afternoon. And we'll get into that in much more detail as we go along. Out of a dozen questions that came up, let me ask the one that feels like most fun at the moment. I've been to Gangotri, checked out the glacier. I know Haridwar quite well. Love that whole region. And at one point, when I was working on the history of human pressures on the Himalayan forests in that region and into Himachal, the question came up, and perhaps it was when we were on pilgrimage, with all those October Bengalis, you know, nobody else there but Bengalis in October. The question came up as to whether there is any way we could tease out any sense of numbers of pilgrims all the way up to Gomukh, because certainly the literary evidence indicates that we have a 2,500-year history of that. But if you take the bus up the newly paved road, you'll wonder how many pilgrims and how much in the way of pilgrim support infrastructure there would have been 500 years ago. To what extent would what we now call Gomukh have been the object of the pilgrimage 1,000 or 2,000 years ago? And maybe this is a question for Tom.
Yeah, but you know, I read Hodgson. Hodgson was who became the Surveyor General of India. He made a trip to Gangotri. I mean, and he was basically, he said that he was the first European at Gomukh. You know, Tiefenthaler, you know, it's debatable whether he got to Gangotri at all, but certainly somebody like James Fraser is given credit for being the first Englishman, or first European actually, to have reached Gangotri. When Hodgson reached Gangotri, you know, there was a massive earthquake, you know, and he took shelter under rocks, but he says it was like this screaming event. But I mean, that aside, he then makes the trip to Gomukh. He says that there was no Indian who went that route. In fact, there was nobody on that route. And he said they may have come in the past. I mean, this is what he's written. He said they may have come in the past. He said, but they don't come anymore. And the priest that accompanies him from Gangotri to Gomukh actually comments on the fact that the icicles in Gomukh, he's so taken up by the icicles in the, you know, in this thing, and says, this is Shiva's hair. You know, I wish I'd come here earlier. But they never came. Nobody went to Gomukh. It's a modern phenomenon. You know, I mean, and I mean, I can't say that categorically, but this is Hodgson's observation, actually. And one gets a sense that a number of these pilgrimage spots, and that's another thing that he observed, by the way, Hodgson observed of the priest in Gangotri. I'm talking 1817. He's very unhappy. The priest in Gangotri is very unhappy at that point in time because all the funds of the pilgrims are going to Badrinath. And he says that temple is doing so well. Why is our temple not doing well? And the Alaknanda has always been this competing. I mean, the Rig Veda speaks of Alaknanda as the source of the Ganges. You know, and the Alaknanda is much longer, and it has always puzzled people. They go there and they go to Badrinath. They don't go to Gangotri. They did not go to Gangotri for many years. So some of the early priests who actually were looking for settlements in Tibet, you know, they actually followed the Alaknanda up to the Manas Pass and actually went to believing that would take them to the source of the Ganges and the source of the Indus, being Mount Kailash, you know, and in other words. So there are the claims actually that are made around Gangotri are extremely dubious in many ways, and that's why I say that Father Tiefenthaler actually pulls Gangotri out of the blue. I mean, I followed the literature before that. I mean, to quite a large extent, actually. In fact, this spring and summer, you know, I've sort of been focusing on that, and it is fascinating to see the lack of claims of Gangotri as a place prior to Tiefenthaler's map, which was drawn in 1770s, 1780s. You know, and he also draws attention to the Gagara as the source of the Ganga, you know, that goes up to Mount Kailash. So, you know, things are extremely questionable, actually, in terms of what people believe and what they, you know, what they claim.
Great, our time is running short. Do we have one final question for Dilip? Yes, Jane.
There's been a lot of work on how pollution, sort of overuse of groundwater, and climate change are affecting rivers in South Asia. If we change our perspective and we think of South Asia not in terms of rivers, but as this hydrological surface, this broader ecological system. How does that impact our understanding of those three phenomena?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think that, I mean, here there's, you know, I mean, I would think that something like this, actually opening up a question, is, you know, has these projective possibilities where people will be thinking of actually gathering water on surfaces. I mean, for us, a hydrological surface just holds water where it falls, you know, I mean, and so you have the whole surface of India wherein you can gather that, this thing, whether it's a coconut grove or a paddy field or a forest or this or that. And I think that when one does that, one is not only decentralizing, one is also then taking charge of actually one's sewage. If one is looking at sewage not as something that goes into a drain and out. I mean, one of the projects in Bombay, which I unfortunately couldn't dwell on, was how do we see this river, this so-called river that people are seeing, not as a flow, but as an overflow. In other words, you cultivate it as a biotic treatment system. So my feeling is that if you actually had to see water as overflowing, you also see sewage as overflowing. And you know, and as overflowing a field structure, and you take charge of it. You know, the rivers have become easy exits for sewage. And that is our primary problem in India, is the crisis of rivers actually as sewage drains. You know, and I think that, so if you had to actually look at cultivating grounds of biotic treatments wherein your sewage is treated there, on your ground, not treated in a treatment plant and sent into a river, I just think that there is you know, that itself will take care of a lot. It just turns, it'll turn our responsibility around as well.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Dilip for getting such a great talk.
Thank you.